For centuries, convents have been seen as places of prayer, devotion, and purity. Hidden behind stone walls, the world has envisioned them as sanctuaries of peace, where the most faithful women dedicate their lives to God. But what if I told you that not all who wore the habit were saints? What if, among the silent corridors and candle-lit chapels, some of the most horrifying secrets in history were concealed? Tonight, we uncover the chilling truth behind those who betrayed their sacred vows, turning places of holiness into dens of corruption, cruelty, and fear. From political manipulation and sinister rituals to unspeakable abuses, these are the most evil nuns who ever walked the earth. Stay with us as we reveal stories that the world tried to forget. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our most shocking investigations. And tell us, do you believe that power can corrupt even the most devout souls? Let us know in the comments. Throughout history, the idea of a nun has been one of discipline, silence, and unwavering faith. These women were meant to represent the highest form of devotion, dedicating their lives to prayer, self-denial, and acts of charity. But the human soul is complex, and even those who take vows of holiness are not immune to darkness. In some cases, the isolation of convent walls became the perfect breeding ground for corruption, cruelty, and sinister acts hidden from the outside world. One of the most notorious examples is Katarina Von Sim, a 16th-century nun whose name is barely mentioned in history books. Born into an aristocratic family in what is now Germany, Katarina was forced into the convent at a young age, a common practice at the time for noble families who wanted to secure both social status and political influence. But Katarina had no intention of spending her life in quiet prayer. From within the convent, she built an intricate network of power, using her position to influence regional politics, broker secret alliances, and even orchestrate assassinations. Unlike the pious sisters around her, Katarina was a master of manipulation. She seduced powerful men, not in a carnal sense, but by offering them the one thing they desired most: control. High-ranking officials sought her counsel, believing she had divine insight into political matters. Kings and nobles whispered her name in dark chambers, fearful of the influence she wielded. What many failed to realize was that Katarina was no prophetess. She was a tactician, playing the game of power from within the sacred walls of the convent. Her downfall came when one of her plots was exposed. She had conspired with a local duke to poison a rival bishop who opposed her influence over the region. When the plot failed, the scandal erupted, and the church was left with no choice but to act. Katarina was stripped of her religious title and sentenced to live the rest of her life in a remote monastery, her name erased from official records. But even in her exile, whispers of her manipulative reign continued. Some say she never truly lost her power, that even in isolation she continued pulling strings from the shadows, ensuring that her enemies never rested easily. But Katarina's story is only the beginning. The corruption of nuns did not always manifest in political games. Some sought power not through diplomacy, but through sheer terror. And that brings us to one of the darkest figures in convent history, Mother Gertrude of Austria. In the early 1800s, Gertrude was the head of an orphanage run by the church. On the surface, she was the epitome of religious devotion, strict but devoted to the children in her care. Yet behind closed doors, the truth was far more sinister. The orphanage became a place of horror, where the most vulnerable children suffered under her merciless rule. Gertrude did not merely enforce discipline. She ruled with an iron fist, instilling terror in those under her authority. Children who disobeyed her were subjected to cruel punishments, locked in dark rooms without food for days, forced to kneel for hours until their legs gave out. Some whispered that she took pleasure in their suffering, watching with satisfaction as they cried for mercy. But the worst part? The church turned a blind eye, convents and orphanages were largely self-governing at the time, meaning that whatever happened within their walls remained a secret. When complaints reached higher authorities, they were dismissed. Who would dare accuse a nun of such atrocities? Who would believe that a woman of God was capable of evil? For years, Mother Gertrude's reign of terror continued, unchecked and unchallenged. It was only when a young girl managed to escape that the truth came to light. The child, malnourished and barely able to speak, was taken in by a local family who soon realized the horrors she had endured. Authorities finally investigated, and what they found shocked even the most hardened officials. Children were found locked in cages, covered in bruises, their bodies weak from starvation. The orphanage was shut down, and Gertrude was sentenced to life in a convent prison, a fate considered lenient given her crimes. But even then, justice was not fully served. Many of her victims never received recognition, their suffering buried under layers of religious bureaucracy. And so the question remains, how many more like her existed? How many nuns, entrusted with the care of others, used their power not for good, but for their own twisted satisfaction? The darkness did not stop with political corruption or physical abuse. In some cases, the evil within convent walls took a more supernatural turn. Jeanne Desange was a nun at the Ursuline convent in 17th century France, a woman whose name would forever be linked to one of the most infamous cases of mass hysteria in religious history. Jeanne was ambitious, too ambitious for her position. She desired power, recognition and influence, but in a world where nuns were expected to be submissive and obedient, how could she rise above her station? She found her answer in a terrifying deception. She claimed to be possessed. The events that followed became one of the most well-documented cases of alleged demonic possession in history. Jeanne and several other nuns at her convent began exhibiting strange behaviors, convulsing, screaming blasphemies, speaking in unknown tongues. The church took notice, sending priests to investigate. Jeanne, seeing an opportunity, played her role perfectly. She accused a local priest, Urbain Grandier, of using sorcery to control them. The accusations led to a full-scale witch trial, one that would end in Grandier's execution. Burned at the stake, he maintained his innocence until his last breath. But for Jeanne, it was a victory. She had become famous, revered as a woman who had survived demonic torment. The church rewarded her with a prestigious position, and she spent the rest of her life reveling in the status she had acquired. But was she truly possessed? Or was it all a grand performance, a calculated act to elevate herself above the restrictions of convent life? Many historians now believe that the entire event was staged, a manipulative ploy by a woman who craved significance in a world that denied her agency. And yet, Jeanne's story serves as a chilling reminder that even within places of supposed holiness, deception and ambition can thrive. When faith is used as a weapon, when power is unchecked, the results can be catastrophic. But these stories are just the tip of the iceberg. There are still more horrors to uncover. Cases of secret rituals, hidden abuses, and nuns who embraced darkness instead of light. What drove them to such evil? Was it the isolation of convent life, the unchecked authority they wielded, or was it something far more sinister? The stories of Katarina Von Sim, Mother Gertrude, and Jeanne Desange reveal an unsettling truth. When the walls of a convent become impenetrable, when authority is absolute and unquestioned, corruption festers. But there is an even darker layer to these tales, one that transcends manipulation and cruelty. In certain cases, the evil lurking within convents took on an entirely different form, one that touched the realm of the occult. For centuries, the Catholic Church has warned against heresy, condemning those who stray from official doctrine. But what happens when the corruption comes not from rebellious outsiders, but from within? In some convents, certain nuns embraced heretical practices, using religious rituals not as a path to salvation, but as a means of power, control, and in some cases, even worship of something far more sinister. One of the most infamous cases comes from 17th century Spain, where reports surfaced of a secretive group of nuns performing rituals that bore little resemblance to traditional Catholic practices. The convent of Santa Maria la Real de las Huelgas was a place of prestige, housing noble women who had been forced into religious life by their families. Among them was a woman known only as Sister Inez, a figure whose name has been buried under layers of historical suppression. Unlike her peers, Inez did not resign herself to a life of silent prayer and obedience. She sought something greater, something beyond the restrictive teachings of the Church. Her quest for knowledge led her down forbidden paths, where she uncovered texts filled with esoteric wisdom, books that should never have been in the hands of a nun. It is said that she began holding secret gatherings within the convent walls, gatherings that had nothing to do with traditional worship. The flickering glow of candlelight, the rhythmic chanting of voices, the scent of burning incense. These were not the sacred practices of the Church, but something entirely different. Witnesses who later spoke of these rituals described them as ceremonies that blurred the line between Christian devotion and something much darker. According to whispers that survived the passage of time, Sister Inez believed she had found a way to communicate with entities beyond the human realm. Some claimed she had abandoned God entirely, instead turning to arcane forces that promised knowledge and power in exchange for devotion. Whether these claims were exaggerated or held some truth, one thing remained certain: the atmosphere within the convent changed. Nuns who once spoke freely became silent. Strange symbols were carved into wooden beams, symbols that no one dared explain. And most disturbing of all, those who questioned Sister Inez disappeared. The Church eventually caught wind of what was happening, and an investigation was launched. What they uncovered was so disturbing that records were sealed, and much of what transpired has been lost to history. But what little remains suggests that the convent was harboring something deeply unholy. Inez and her closest followers were expelled, their fate unknown. Some say they were quietly executed, their deaths disguised as divine punishment. Others believe they simply vanished, taking their forbidden knowledge with them. And yet, this was not an isolated incident. Similar rumors surfaced in Italy, France, and even as far as Mexico. Again and again, reports emerged of nuns dabbling in unorthodox rituals, mixing Christian imagery with forbidden practices. Some were accused of engaging in rites meant to summon spirits, others of creating talismans that bore no resemblance to Christian relics. In every case, the Church responded the same way: silence, suppression, and the quiet removal of those involved. But if the Church covered up so many of these cases, what else remains hidden? How many more convents were home to nuns who strayed from their faith, not just through earthly corruption, but through something far more arcane? One particularly disturbing case involved a convent in 19th century France, where a group of nuns was discovered engaging in what local priests described as blasphemous rites. Witnesses reported seeing processions at night, where hooded figures moved in eerie silence, carrying objects wrapped in cloth, objects that, according to later testimony, were human remains. The nuns involved were said to have communicated with something they referred to only as the voice, an entity they believed granted them wisdom beyond human comprehension. Of course, the official records barely mention these events. The convent in question was mysteriously abandoned within a year, the nuns dispersed, and any mention of their activities erased. But folklore in the surrounding villages kept the legend alive, warning future generations never to approach the ruins of the convent after dark. And yet, while some nuns sought power through manipulation or the occult, others wielded control through more direct means: fear. Mother Agnes of Portugal was one such figure. Unlike the others, Her story did not involve political intrigue or esoteric knowledge. Instead, she ruled through sheer, brutal terror. Born into a prominent family, Agnes entered religious life not out of devotion, but as a punishment. She had been known for her cruelty even as a child, an unsettling trait that should have been a warning to those who placed her in a position of authority. But within the isolated world of the convent, her darkness flourished. She became the abbess at a convent known for its strict discipline, and under her rule, that discipline became something else entirely. Whispers began to spread of nuns who had fallen out of favor with her disappearing overnight. Those who questioned her authority were subjected to cruel punishments, locked away in cells for days without food, forced to endure physical torment, their pleas ignored. But the most horrifying part of her reign, the way she justified it. Unlike other cruel figures in history, who at least attempted to hide their actions, Mother Agnes wore her brutality like a badge of honor. She claimed that suffering purified the soul, that pain was the path to God. And so, she inflicted it with righteous conviction, believing herself to be an instrument of divine wrath. For years, she operated without consequence, her reputation striking fear into anyone who dared oppose her. It was only when a young novice, barely 16 years old, managed to flee the convent and expose what was happening that the truth came to light. An investigation followed, and what the church found was beyond anything they had expected. In hidden chambers beneath the convent, records were uncovered detailing punishments that bordered on medieval torture. Chains, iron restraints, and even instruments of flagellation were found, all used under the guise of religious discipline. Mother Agnes was stripped of her position and sent to live out her days in isolation, but for many it was not enough. The lives she had ruined, the young women she had tortured in the name of faith, there was no justice that could erase what had happened. And yet, the cycle continued. Again and again, stories of cruel, manipulative, or outright dangerous nuns surfaced throughout history, only to be buried by those who wished to maintain the illusion of purity within religious institutions. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all of these stories is what they suggest. If so many cases have been covered up, how many more remain undiscovered? How many convents have harbored their own secrets, hidden behind veils of silence and devotion? The deeper we dig, the more disturbing these stories become. But what if I told you that some of the most terrifying tales of corrupt nuns didn't just involve power, abuse, or manipulation? What if, in some cases, their actions defied logic and entered the realm of the truly unexplainable? Some say that certain convents held dark secrets, not just in the form of human corruption, but something far worse, something supernatural. One such case took place in 18th century Italy, in a small convent near Milan. The woman at the center of this chilling account was Sister Maria Crocifissa della Concezione. At first glance, she seemed to be an ordinary nun, deeply devoted to her faith. But what set her apart was a series of letters. Letters she claimed were dictated to her by a demonic entity. The most famous of these letters was written in a strange, unrecognizable script. It was said to be indecipherable, a mix of archaic symbols, unknown characters, and elements of various languages, none of which formed a coherent text. Scholars and priests alike tried to decode it, but for centuries, no one could. The Church dismissed it as the ramblings of an unstable mind, yet those who knew Sister Maria personally swore she was not mad. According to those around her, she would enter trance-like states, her body rigid, her face twisted in agony as if she were battling an unseen force. When she awoke, she would have no memory of what had happened. And then there were the nights when the convent would be disturbed by the sound of guttural whispers echoing through the stone corridors, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Was Sister Maria truly tormented by something beyond human comprehension, or was this a case of psychological distress amplified by the oppressive isolation of convent life? The letter itself remained a mystery for centuries until 2017, when modern cryptographers finally managed to decode parts of it. The unsettling message contained phrases that seemed to reject Christianity, calling God a creation of man and referring to humans as servants of chaos. Had Sister Maria truly received these words from some external entity? Or had she, consciously or not, fabricated them herself? No one knows for sure, but her case serves as another example of how the minds of those trapped in these religious institutions could descend into darkness, whether through their own desires, external manipulation, or something far more sinister. And yet, for all the supernatural whispers, some nuns didn't need the influence of spirits or demons to commit evil. Some did so entirely by their own free will. Take the case of Sister Margarite of Belgium, a 19th-century nun whose name was spoken in hushed tones long after her death. At first, she was seen as a woman of unparalleled discipline, someone who demanded absolute obedience from those under her rule. But behind closed doors, her methods were anything but holy. She ran a convent school for young girls, a place meant to educate and prepare them for a life of religious devotion. But Sister Margarite didn't see herself as a teacher. She saw herself as a ruler. Her punishments were legendary. Students who disobeyed her were subjected to horrifying ordeals, forced fasting, brutal physical discipline, and in some cases outright torture. And yet, despite the growing fear among the students, the outside world saw only the facade of a respectable religious institution. The parents of these young girls believed they were being raised in an environment of faith and discipline, unaware of the horrors taking place behind those stone walls. It wasn't until a young girl managed to flee the convent that the truth was exposed. Emaciated, bruised, and barely able to speak, she was found by a local priest who, upon hearing her story, launched an immediate investigation. What authorities uncovered was beyond comprehension. Rooms designed for punishment, iron restraints hidden beneath the chapel floor, journals in which Sister Margarite recorded her methods as if they were part of some grand experiment. When confronted, she showed no remorse. In fact, she seemed almost proud of what she had done, claiming that suffering brought enlightenment. She was stripped of her title, removed from the convent, and sent into exile. But the trauma she inflicted lived on in her victims, many of whom never fully recovered. And still, Sister Margarite's case was not unique. Over and over again, history reveals these horrifying accounts of religious figures who used their authority not for salvation, but for suffering. But what makes these cases so terrifying is the fact that they were hidden for so long. The closed nature of convents meant that even the worst abuses could be concealed. Who would dare question a woman in holy robes? Who would believe that behind the serene image of prayer and devotion, there were individuals who thrived on power, pain, and manipulation? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many of these stories have been lost to time? As we continue, we will uncover even more terrifying accounts. From secret underground chambers to forbidden texts hidden within convent libraries, the next revelations will challenge everything we thought we knew about the sanctity of religious life. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of evil hiding in plain sight. When we think of wickedness, we imagine figures cloaked in darkness, criminals lurking in the shadows. But what happens when that darkness wears the robes of a nun, when it kneels before the altar, whispers prayers with lips that have spoken lies, and hides its sins behind the veil of sanctity? History is filled with stories of religious figures who used their power for manipulation, cruelty, and even worse. But the tales that follow are perhaps the most disturbing of all. These are not just stories of corruption. They are stories of nuns who reveled in their acts, who became architects of suffering, who twisted faith into something unrecognizable. One such figure was Sister Juliana of Austria, a woman whose crimes were so heinous that even the Church struggled to contain the scandal. Unlike the other stories we've covered, her tale does not involve secret rituals or hidden messages. No, her evil was entirely human, and it was terrifying. Juliana was placed in a convent as a child, a common practice for noble families who wished to secure religious prestige. But from a young age, she exhibited a disturbing trait. She lacked empathy. While the other girls in the convent found solace in their faith, Juliana found pleasure in domination. When she became the head of her convent, she ruled with an iron grip. The punishments she imposed went beyond discipline. They became a form of entertainment. Nuns who displeased her were subjected to brutal conditions, deprived of food, forced to sleep in the cold, their cries ignored. But it wasn't just physical suffering she inflicted. She thrived on psychological torment. One of her most infamous acts involved a young novice named Clara, a girl known for her kindness and unwavering faith. Juliana saw Clara's purity as a challenge. She made it her mission to break the girl, subjecting her to relentless humiliation. She would force Clara to confess sins she had never committed, isolating her from the others, whispering into her ear at night that God had abandoned her. Clara, once full of light, began to wither under Juliana's cruelty, and then, one day, she was found dead in her cell. The cause? Officially, it was declared an illness, but those who lived in the convent knew better. Clara had been driven to despair. Juliana's reign of terror continued for years, and yet no one dared stop her. The church, unwilling to confront the scandal, quietly transferred her to another convent. She continued her rule elsewhere, her sins buried under the weight of religious bureaucracy. And she was not alone. Across the world, similar stories emerged. Nuns who saw their positions not as a calling, but as an opportunity to control, to torment, to destroy. One of the most haunting cases comes from Mexico, where in the 19th century, a convent became the site of a horrifying discovery. In the heart of Mexico City, the Santa Rosa convent was known for its strict adherence to discipline. But what the public didn't know was that within its walls, something far more sinister was happening. For years, whispers circulated about Sister Maria Dolores, a woman whose presence sent shivers down the spines of even her fellow nuns. She was not like the others. She rarely spoke, except in moments of fury. Her punishments were legendary. Nuns who stepped out of line found themselves locked away for days, surviving on nothing but water and stale bread. But it wasn't until renovations began on the convent decades later that the full horror of her actions was revealed. Behind a crumbling section of the convent's stone walls, workers made a gruesome discovery: hidden chambers filled with skeletal remains. Dozens of bodies, their bones showing signs of malnourishment, restraint, and in some cases, clear indications of torture. Who were these victims? Were they runaway nuns, locked away and forgotten? Were they unwanted infants, disposed of in the secrecy of the convent's walls? The truth remains uncertain. What is known is that Sister Maria Dolores vanished before she could face justice. Some say she fled into the mountains, living the rest of her days in exile. Others believe the church, desperate to avoid another scandal, took care of the problem in a way that ensured she would never be heard from again. But these stories, as horrifying as they are, lead to a bigger question. How many more like them have existed throughout history? How many convents, sealed off from the outside world, have concealed horrors that may never come to light? The isolation of convent life created the perfect breeding ground for unchecked power. It is no surprise that some nuns, removed from accountability, allowed their darkest impulses to flourish. But what is most chilling is the idea that this is not just history. Even in modern times, there have been disturbing reports. Nuns accused of abuse in orphanages, of mistreating those under their care, of wielding fear instead of faith. Though the world has changed, the potential for corruption remains. But why? What drives individuals who have taken sacred vows to commit such acts? Is it the oppressive nature of convent life, the loss of personal freedom that warps the mind? Or is it something more fundamental, proof that even in the most pious settings, evil can take root? As we approach the final revelations in our journey, we will explore the most disturbing cases yet. Cases that suggest that some nuns were not just corrupt or cruel, but that they had fully embraced evil itself. As we have uncovered throughout this journey, history is littered with tales of nuns who abandoned their vows of purity and holiness, trading them for power, cruelty, and in some cases, something far more sinister. But there is still one final layer to this story, one that transcends the boundaries of human corruption and ventures into the realm of the truly unthinkable. In the late 1800s, a convent in Romania became the center of a case so horrifying that it was almost erased from historical records. The events that took place there were whispered about in fear, described as something unnatural, something beyond the ordinary evil found in human hearts. The convent was known as the Sisters of Divine Mercy, a place isolated deep within the Carpathian Mountains. It was home to a small group of nuns who had taken vows of absolute silence, dedicating themselves to prayer and solitude. But as the years went on, disturbing rumors began to emerge. Villagers who lived in the valley below spoke of eerie lights flickering from the convent windows at night, of strange chanting that did not resemble any known form of Christian worship. Some claimed that travelers who sought refuge at the convent never returned, their fates unknown. But it wasn't until a young priest named Father Anton was sent to investigate that the full horror came to light. Upon his arrival, he was met with an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick with decay. The once pristine walls of the convent were crumbling, and the nuns, those who remained, looked gaunt, their eyes hollow, their bodies emaciated beyond explanation. He soon discovered why. The convent had ceased its usual religious practices. Instead, the sisters had embraced something else, something they believed would bring them closer to divine enlightenment. What exactly they had turned to remains a mystery, but what is known is that their rituals were nothing short of terrifying. The few surviving documents from the investigation describe what Father Anton found in the lower chambers of the convent: ancient symbols drawn in blood, pages of scripture defaced with unholy markings, and most disturbingly, a sealed room that had been deliberately walled off. When the authorities finally broke through, they found something that defied comprehension. Corpses, positioned in unnatural poses, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The nuns who had survived refused to speak of what had happened. Some claimed it was divine punishment. Others whispered that they had invited something into the convent, something that could not be sent back. Within a week, the convent was abandoned. The church ordered it sealed, its history erased, its name stricken from official records. To this day, the ruins remain, untouched, a place of fear for those who live nearby. It is one of many stories that suggest that sometimes the corruption of the soul goes beyond human evil, that sometimes what lurks behind convent walls is something much darker. So, what do we take away from all of this? These stories are not just about history. They are a testament to the fact that power, when left unchecked, can turn even the holiest of places into breeding grounds for corruption. They remind us that behind every institution, no matter how sacred, there are human beings, flawed, ambitious, and sometimes dangerous. And they force us to ask an uncomfortable question. If these were the stories that managed to come to light, how many more have been successfully buried? How many other nuns throughout history have used their sacred vows as a shield, hiding their darkness behind the illusion of piety? The truth is, we may never know the full extent of these horrors. But what we do know is this: history is filled with secrets, and the most shocking ones are often hidden in places we least expect. If this video made you think, if it opened your eyes to a side of history that few dare to speak about, then make sure to like this video, comment your thoughts below, and share your opinions. Do you think power always corrupts, even in places of faith? Or were these just isolated cases, exceptions to the rule? And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that expose the hidden truths, the forgotten scandals, the dark corners of history that few dare to uncover, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have so much more to reveal. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and never stop questioning the past.